Well, hello, my name is Randy Silva. I have been doing various live streams on Christian topics, and today is part 6 of the series called How to Worship God. So let's go ahead and get started. So last week, I did a little bit more reviewing, or let's say comparing and contrasting the Old Covenant with the New Covenant. There are many, many differences, and most of them are huge differences. And so I would say that if your Old Covenant and New Covenant are very similar, then you should rethink your New Covenant. In the New Covenant, you get every blessing, every spiritual blessing up front, and it promises no physical blessings. Under the Old Covenant, though, you had to gain the blessings through obedience to the Old Covenant. And likely you would not be able to do that, and you would get curses instead. And this is a huge difference. But the other thing we talked about was how it seems as though many Christians do not enjoy the blessings, the spiritual blessings of the indwelling Holy Spirit. Oftentimes they don't give it much thought. And this could be due to the difficulty in teaching spiritual intangible matters. And that is part of what Jeremiah 31 verse 34 says. I also talked about how the ecclesia is all about the Greek word allelon. And that is the Greek word that is translated as one another. And there are a lot of one another, over 30 one another passages in the Gospels and the epistles, or the whole New Testament. So whenever you see the word church in the New Testament, you should replace it with the words house gathering or house assembly. And whenever you see the one another term, so one another, insert at your house gatherings before it. For example, if the passage says, love one another, then you would translate that as, or interpret it as, at your house gatherings, love one another. And that's because in those days, from the 1st century to the 3rd century, to the end of the 3rd century, and the beginning of the 4th, the Christian assembly was in small gatherings in people's houses, especially in the times of Paul and the apostles. So that is why it would make sense when they are talking about how to love one another and how to bear with one another and how to get along with one another. The author is actually talking about how to do that at your house gatherings. Lastly, I spoke about removing your veil. That was a nod to Moses, how Israelites implored him to wear a veil when he would come from meeting with God because his face would be glowing. And in the new covenant, now that the Spirit lives inside of us and we are the temple of God, temple of the Holy Spirit, removing your veil means to be able to feel comfortable in talking to others, other Christians and non-Christians, about the Spirit of God that is within you. A lot of times we feel like we shouldn't do that. Maybe it might feel too mysterious. You don't want to be considered or seen as someone who's crazy. But that is what it means to remove your veil under the new covenant. Moving on to today's subject, the title of today is Worship in Large Vertical Assemblies of Christians. Now, the first thing I want to make sure we understand is this idea, these words that I've been using, vertical and horizontal, in association with assemblies. Here is the term vertical and horizontal. And these can mean different things in different contexts, whether you're talking about worshiping God or if you're talking about a corporation, they mean different things. But here we are talking about a Christian gathering. Some alternatives to the word vertical are stage-centered, pulpit-centered, or what you could call the platform model, because oftentimes it's a stage or a platform. The idea is that in vertical churches, people are gathered around or in front of a stage or a pulpit or a platform. Whereas in the horizontal churches, the horizontal gatherings, it's more of a circle of people gathered in a circle. They're gathered there for the mutual benefit of each other. And you could also call this the one another model, as we were talking about last week and the week before about the one another passages. This is a model which amplifies, or it's for the purpose of, one another relationships. So the focus in vertical churches, they're focused on whoever the speaker or speakers are up front, or if they're singing songs, whoever the song leader or song leaders are. And only a small percentage of the congregation ever serves as speakers or singers. As I put, they need to stand out, but they'll pick the best speakers, the best singers that are able to do these things so that they can benefit the congregation. And you will also have a small number of paid staff, and that's a small number compared to the size of the congregation. If your congregation is 100 to 200, let's say, you might have 2 paid staff members, but if your church is 1,000 or 2,000, you might have 10 paid staff. That's still very small compared to the size of the congregation. Now, the focus in the horizontal model, horizontal gatherings, is whoever the person who is currently speaking. That's who everybody is focused on. But it doesn't remain on that person. Each person takes turns with something to offer to the group, depending on what their spiritual strengths are. If it's teaching, maybe they'll teach a little bit. If it's preaching, maybe they'll preach a little bit. If preaching is required, even if they're not great at it, then whoever's the best at it might do the preaching, or whoever has the convictions. If it's singing a hymn, then it's singing a hymn. If it's praying, then whatever the person feels the Spirit is calling them to do, that is what they will do in turn. And you won't have any paid staff for this horizontal house church model. You might have some traveling preachers or teachers, some people who are really good at it, or people who are educated, maybe they have degrees in theology or such. Those people may be paid, and might be paid a little bit from each house church. And it's the type of model you see in the New Testament with Paul, for instance, as he would travel around to the different churches, or when he would write a letter to a church and they would read that letter. That would be like teaching and preaching to the congregation as the letter is read to each of these small house church gatherings in the particular city. The key words of a vertical gathering, it's a monologue, so it's just one person speaking at a time. It's passive from the perspective of the congregation. They are passively sitting there enjoying whatever is going on. Maybe they're singing along with the singers. If it's preaching or teaching that's going on, they are listening to it and taking it in. And that would make them a spectator. And spectator has a negative connotation in the church setting. Oftentimes a preacher might say from the pulpit, don't just be a spectator. That means they want you to do something, but in a large church gathering, that means to do it later on, to do it after church. They wouldn't want everybody to start speaking all at once from the congregation. That makes those vertical assemblies impersonal. It does educate people, and that is one of the key words, is that it helps educate people. And you could also say it props people up, which would be a negative thing, but it might be a positive thing. If somebody is particularly shy or meek, they might need to sort of hide amongst the congregation. The key words for a horizontal church meeting is dialogue. So not only is there just one person in the small group talking, but they're not just talking. They might ask a question, they might get an answer. Somebody might just ask a question if they didn't understand something. So it's a dialogue. And that makes it an active setting. Everybody is actively engaged. And that makes people participators rather than participants. And that also makes it relational. So these people probably live near each other. Maybe they're neighbors. They get to know each other. And it's a relational setting. And the purpose is to edify people. It may be to educate if it's teaching that's going on, or it might be something else. But the idea is, like 1 Corinthians 14:26 says, is to, whatever you do in your church, make sure that everybody's built up one another, which is what that last keyword is, to build up. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of vertical versus horizontal gatherings from the perspective of the congregation or the group in the house in the small horizontal context. The next point I have is I called it "Let's not make superficial changes to a broken system." And that's another term for the less politically correct term of putting lipstick on a pig. Perhaps you've heard that term. A more professional way of saying it is to not make superficial changes to a broken system, a system that just can't be fixed. You might as well start with something else, do something else. And it also has to do with what's called the sunken cost fallacy. And when it comes to large vertical church gatherings, when it comes to those large churches with their large established buildings and their staff, the sunken cost fallacy is a tendency to keep pouring resources into that church based on the resources that you've already spent, even when it would be more rational to abandon it and go to a different model. If it turns out, for instance, that the Christianity of small horizontal churches isn't just like another option, which perhaps maybe up until this point, maybe I think that's probably how I've talked about it, is that this is another option that you can try. But more so than that, if it turns out that it's not just another option, but the only option, or by far the best option, then you have to be willing to move to the small horizontal gathering model. Not stay stuck in the vertical model just because you have this building that you already built or you have these staff people. Obviously, you can help the staff people get new jobs or something. I'm not saying you just throw them out or something, or maybe you can find a role where they're still being paid or something. But the idea is, and this is something I put forward in the prior series, the Christian Assembly, about how much money has been spent by Christianity with buildings and staff. It's like $50 to $80 trillion throughout history that has been spent. So a lot of money has been spent, and what do they have to show for it? Okay, so you don't want to get stuck in the sunk cost fallacy. Now, what is the evidence that small horizontal gatherings meet the needs that are specified in the Bible, in the New Testament, of individuals, but large vertical gatherings do not? Simply put, it is the Bible itself and history. Among other things, we have learned that worship is very different under the New Covenant as compared to the Old Covenant. And this was demonstrated in the small horizontal gatherings of the Christian church from the 1st century to the 3rd century in comparison to what had been going on in the Old Covenant at the temple, which would be an example of a large vertical gathering. The New Covenant Christians chose to meet in small houses. We also talked about how that wasn't just to evade persecution. At times it was, but most of the time it was because that was what they chose to do. So that is the history. Another part of the history is that right at the beginning of the 4th century, when they moved from the small horizontal gathering to the large vertical gathering model, we see large unbiblical changes occur precisely at that moment. So you see things like power and oppression. Remember, there was the group that was in North Africa that was oppressed by the rest of the church in the Empire of Rome because they didn't like what they were saying, and so the only records we have of whatever they believed in was what the people who were in Rome said about them. Now, to be fair, the impetus of switching to the large vertical gatherings at the beginning of the 4th century was Emperor Constantine and the power and money that he poured into the church. So we don't know what would have happened if they had stayed in the small house gathering, because that's not what happened. It is sort of what happened in North Africa, and we saw that with the Donatists, and we saw that they were persecuted by the larger church with power and with persecution. So we don't know what it would have been like. But what I would say is that we do know that it wouldn't have happened if they had remained in small churches. So the Constantine, remember when let's just say the best case scenario, he became a Christian, he saw a sign in the sky and that was from God, and that showed him he was going to win this battle, and so he converted to Christianity. Say all that is true and good. He still chose to transform what had been small gatherings into large centralized gatherings, and it was for the very purpose of controlling the masses. Whether that was, he was out of the goodness of his heart or out of the badness of his political emperor nature, either way, we know that's what happened. And in addition to that, we've witnessed this phenomenon over and over again throughout the ages, all the way into modern times, where bad things happen in large churches simply because of the power that a particular leader has and exerts over their large church. And if that same person had been in a small church, you could say they probably would have done it to the small church, but they wouldn't have that same impact. They wouldn't be able to transform or affect or manipulate all those people in a large group if they were small settings. I would say also that it remains true to this day that it is still more difficult to control small, intimate gatherings, if that is what you were looking for. If you're someone who's looking to control people. Now, the primary purpose of large vertical assemblies, so what we would call large churches are just typical churches. The purpose of them is to worship God through song, preaching, teaching, and communion. I believe all large churches, especially evangelical and non-denominational churches, would agree with that assessment. They're there to worship God, and the various aspects, the various elements of the service help them to do that, hopefully. So here I've entitled this Activity Dynamics of Christian Gatherings. So here we have large vertical gatherings in this column, the second column, and small horizontal gatherings in this right column. And then here is the activity or the element of the church service. So if we want to talk about preaching, then that a preacher gets to preach to a large number of people. And likely it's high quality because they've chosen this person because he's good at doing it. He's good at preaching. There's no interaction. There might be some amens or go brother or whatever, call outs from the congregation, which is a little bit of a response, a feedback. But nevertheless, it's very small, and nobody's most likely not raising their hand with questions or just, yelling out some question or even yelling out something like, this isn't right, you're not teaching the right thing or something. That's very unlikely to happen. So this person is able to preach without interruption, and I put scattering aimlessly. I guess that would have a negative connotation to it, but what I mean is the preacher doesn't know, especially if there's 1,000 people in the service, he doesn't know the needs of all the people. Perhaps the Spirit gave him a message, or perhaps he's just witnessed some things throughout the week about some people in the congregation, and that is what was the impetus for his sermon. Whatever it is, though, it's not like he knows what's going on in the whole church, or that what's going on in the whole church is the same thing. Very unlikely. And so it's not personalized. And you are just speaking to whoever it happens to apply to. And maybe it will apply to everybody at some point in their life. But at that exact moment, It's probably not applying to everybody. Now I put here unable to hide because, able to hide because someone in a group of 100 or 1,000 just sitting out in the seats, maybe they're on their phone, maybe they're not listening, maybe they're thinking of lunch after the sermon or whatever. But it's not like the preacher could see this person daydreaming and just call them out. Hey, what are you doing over there? So this leads to clergy laity issues. So clergy is like the paid staff, and laity is like everybody else. And because you have a small number of highly qualified people who are preaching to a large group of people, then that large group will then tend to, I don't even know if tend is the right word, they will become the laity. Now, the preacher may not consider himself better or some of these other aspects of clergy, but nevertheless, you will have this separation of the person who's preaching versus the rest of the congregation, or the small number of people who preach. Now, in a small horizontal group, small horizontal group, you might have lower quality messages, but I put that they would be more sincere. I think I've seen this in large churches that I've gone to, where someone who's untrained, who goes up there, maybe they're stuttering, maybe they start out by saying, hey, wow, I'm really nervous. People still listen to that, and those types of messages tend to impact them even more because of the sincerity. It's not that people know that this is not a polished speaker. So when that happens in a small group, or if that's all that happens in a small group, then they will tend to be more sincere. And you will have this dialogue back and forth with each other. So you have this interaction and response. So the teacher, or the preacher in this case, is not just scattering aimlessly. He knows the people who are there, and so he can target the needs of those people and connect personally with them. And so I guess that's a duplicate. Personalized, it's connecting personally, so it's personalized. But people are not able to hide. If someone is there and one week after another, they just kind of sit there and let not the pulpit, but the time when they would offer something just pass, then most likely somebody will try to pull them out of that shell and try to help them to give whatever it is that is their talent or their gifts. And that these services then, these small horizontal groups, are all about the one another passages, and all people then tend to mature. You don't have this clergy laity issue where the clergy is constantly learning more and more and studying more and more, and the laity just takes it in at the services, but they're really not learning all the details like the clergy person who's studying these things out before they do their service. So because everybody's interacting and because everybody's offering and participating, they will all tend to mature in their spirituality. Okay, so then you think about communion. You might have, I've put this a higher quality charge. So that's the person who goes up and says something about the communion or reads a scripture about the communion beforehand. Maybe you might have a higher quality speaker, but you are most likely, except for maybe in rare occasions where the church might have like a potluck or something, it's just going to be the symbolic elements of the meal. And it's probably not even going to be a loaf of bread and a chalice of wine. It's going to be wafers and a little cup or something. And mostly what's going to happen is people are going to be silently meditating in their seats, waiting for their turn to go up and get communion, or for the communion trays to reach them. In a small horizontal setting, you have a personalized remembrance. So the person knows these people. It may not be as high quality of words, but nevertheless, they can say how what Jesus did for them affected them in a way that is targeted for the people that he knows that are in their house or in this house. And it's a whole meal. We see that the early church evolved away from that when they went towards this idea of the real presence, that the flesh and blood of Jesus are actually in the communion. But before that, it was a whole meal, a fellowship, and that is what the scriptures talk about, like in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11. So with teaching, I say it's the same things as preaching, but also you can think of this as a large class size, and typically that has a negative connotation. You wouldn't want to be in a college situation with hundreds of students, because then you don't get any interaction. You don't get any. It's difficult to have one-on-one time with the professor. In this case, it's the same kind of analogy that you have a teacher that is teaching things to this large group. So same thing with the small horizontal group. You have preaching, but now you have a small class sizes, and you have interaction and clarification. So the person just doesn't move on from a point when somebody's lost. The person could say, "Hey, I don't understand what's going on." If you think about singing, definitely higher quality. It kind of depends on the church you go to. Some churches may have like almost something you might want to buy tickets to. Otherwise, other churches may just have a small band or maybe acoustic guitar or something. But nevertheless, it's the chances of it being higher quality from a small group are there just because of the numbers. It leads to an emotional experience, and people in these large vertical churches tend to latch on to that. I mean, they like this emotional ride that they get to go on. You're also able to hide in these groups. If you don't want to sing, you can just kind of stand there and nobody cares. You're in a large group. Whether you're one of the song leaders or if you're in the congregation, you tend to put your attention towards the performance. You don't want to have the words wrong. You don't want to, maybe you're singing a particular part like tenor or alto or bass. And I put repetition is okay. A lot of these songs, especially in the modern evangelical churches, are very repetitive. Could you imagine that type of repetition in a small group? Nobody would put up with it for it. You wouldn't have a 9-minute long song where you're praising the blood of Jesus 100 times. It just wouldn't make sense in a small group setting. It makes sense in a large group setting because everybody is sort of swaying and being moved emotionally. With a small horizontal church, you might have lower quality singing, but it's about the spiritual experience. You're not able to hide. Maybe you can't sing, but you can still do your best. There is more attention to the meaning of the songs, and you'd find that if we did this nowadays, a lot of the songs actually have either very simple meanings or low quality meanings, or sometimes just outright heretical meanings. And you probably don't even notice it because in the large church gatherings, because you're just singing it. So if you might also have like a kids' church, where the kids go off and they are taught by teachers during the service so that the adults can pay attention. And you, in a large church setting, you'll definitely have higher quality teaching, higher quality crafts, but you'll have little parental involvement. And you'll have weak relationships because these aren't your kids, they're not your neighbor's kids. They might be in some circumstances, but most of the time, especially if it's a large congregation, this is just somebody's kids that you are there to look over for an hour, maybe teach them something about the Bible. And I have found, at least in the churches that I've gone to, that it's very difficult to find volunteers for these kids' services. And I think most of the time they say that has something to do with is wrong with the hearts of the congregants, which is probably true. But why is it wrong with the hearts of the congregants? There's a lack of ownership for the kids. There's a lack of involvement with the people. They just don't want to do this. And so it's difficult to find volunteers. Assuming you do, have some kids and you maybe move them over to the corner of the room or another room or something, in a lot of cases, they may actually just be in the room and they'll learn what it means to worship or to participate, is a better word, in these small gatherings. But if you do have a small aside with children, then it'll be more heartfelt because this will be your community, your children potentially, or maybe your neighbor's children's. You have this idea of parental responsibility. So it is every parent's responsibility to ultimately train their kids in the right ways of God. You might have some praying during a service, and in a large church service, very few, probably just one person participates. There's a weak association with the people who are out there. And of course, somebody might be on their phone or not even thinking about the prayer. You're able to hide. Nobody knows about it. If you do pray in the small group settings, then you can have more people participate. One person can pray, and then maybe another person might pray after them. And there's a strong association. They know each other's needs. They know if somebody's donkey needs to be prayed for, or maybe their child is sick and needs to be prayed for. And you're not able to hide because there's this small group again. So the question you might ask then is, what is accomplished in large vertical gatherings that can't be done in a small horizontal gathering? And I would say the answer is evangelism. Evangelism of the masses. If you look at the New Testament examples of when there was a person like Jesus or one of the apostles preaching to or teaching a large group of people, like you can think of, for instance, the Sermon on the Mount, or when Jesus fed the 5,000 or the 4,000, or when Jesus had large crowds following him and he turned to them and addressed them, or when the apostles on the day of Pentecost baptized 3,000 people. There had to have been at least 3,000 people there. All those cases are a Christian preaching the gospel to a large group of people. And if you look at the percentage of Christians to non-Christians, it's like almost 100% non-Christians. But if you look in large churches, that's the opposite. It's a very small number of non-Christians, and most of them are Christians. So that would have a meaning, that would have a purpose still in the modern day sense. If there was someone who was really good at preaching to evangelizing and preaching to the non-Christians of their society, of their culture, then it would be great to be able to get them into a large room and let the Spirit minister to all of them at once. But would a large modern church say this is possible now? Probably not. Most pastors would say that the conversion of non-Christians is best done in small groups anyway. I don't know if that's true or not. We don't see that in the Bible, but it seems that there's some truth to that. So this fact, I think, really is the final nail in the coffin of large vertical assemblies. So next week, we will talk about more practicals of small house church assemblies, how those things would work. Thanks again for joining me this evening. Remember to like and subscribe and share with your friends, and have a great evening.